last panelist this evening is a very distinguished diplomat and author, Ambassador Chaz Freeman. He broke the string here in that he actually did his undergraduate work down the road at Yale. I also spent some time in Mexico and Taiwan, and then, but then he did come back and got his JD at Harvard. So I think we have pretty much a hat trick here on the podium. Chaz was our ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia during the time of Desert Storm, and did a remarkable job in very, very challenging circumstances that ended up, I think, with great success. He began his long and distinguished diplomatic career in India, and then achieved quite a bit of fame as the official translator for the Nixon Initiative to China in 1972. And he's had a lengthy interaction with Chinese people and the government ever since then. Fascinating story. He was our deputy chief of mission, both in Beijing and in Bangkok. It's pretty much the central diplomatic post in the Far East. And he was our assistant secretary of state for African affairs back in Washington, Department of State. Then he jumped across the river and was the assistant secretary of defense for international security affairs in the Pentagon for a couple of very interesting years in the transition out of the Cold War and the, shall we say, remake of NATO into an organization to look outward and deal with current events rather than the Cold War. So Chaz has had a very, very lengthy career, published a lot, highly sought for his opinions, and he's not usually very shy, so I would expect Chaz will be very forthright with us. Chaz, welcome.
Thank you, Fox. It's great to be here. Before I launch into a presentation, I want to just sort of describe where I'm coming from. For 30 years, I was a consumer of intelligence as well as a producer of it. I was also a victim of it. Every bedroom that I ever stayed in had cameras in the walls and microphones as well. And everywhere I went in the course of my professional career as a diplomat, my personal effects were searched. The clumsiest such search actually took place in Honolulu, and the second clumsiest was here in Cambridge. But in any event, I have a strong view that ordinary Americans or people not associated with government officialdom should not have to live their lives in the goldfish bowl that I did. We live in what NSA has called the golden age of signals intelligence, or SIGINT. We might have guessed this, but we now know it for a fact because of a spectacular act of civil disobedience by Edward Snowden. His is perhaps the most consequential such act for both our domestic liberties and our foreign policies, our foreign relations, in the more than 2 centuries of our republic's history. This past spring, Mr. Snowden decided to place his oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States and his allegiance to the Bill of Rights above his contractual obligations to the intelligence community and the government for which it snoops. He blew the whistle on NSA's ruthless drive for digital omniscience. And when he did this, he knew that many of his fellow citizens would impugn his patriotism. He also knew he would be prosecuted for violating the growing maze of legislation that criminalizes revelations about the national security practices of America's post-9/11 warfare state. Mr. Snowden does not dispute that he is guilty of legally criminal acts, but he places himself in the long line of Americans convinced, as Martin Luther King put it, that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as cooperation with good. As someone long in service to our country, I am upset by such defiance of authority. But as an American, I am not. Like Henry David Thoreau and many others in protest movements in our country over the past century and a half, Mr. Snowden deliberately broke the law to bring to public attention government behavior he considered at odds with the U.S. Constitution, American values, and the rule of law. One point he wanted to make was that we Americans now live under a government that precludes legal or political challenges to its own increasingly deviant behavior. Our government has criminalized the release of information exposing such behavior or revealing the policies that authorize it. The only way to challenge its activities and policies is to break the law by exposing them. Mr. Snowden justifies his flight abroad on the grounds that had he remained within the jurisdiction of the United States, he could not have had a fair trial, would very likely have been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment, and would have been isolated and silenced to avert informed debate by Americans about the public policy issues his revelations raise. Not so very long ago, let's say in the time of Daniel Ellsberg, it would have been fairly easy to show that such fears were groundless. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case. Mr. Snowden has been driven to ground in Russia, a country with an incomparably worse record of lawlessness than ours, that he never intended to visit, let alone reside in. If he tries to go elsewhere, he will be hunted down and made to disappear. Post 9/11, practices not seen in our political culture since the abolition of the Starr Chamber by the Habeas Corpus Act of 1640 have again become commonplace. Such practices include, but are not limited to, detention without charge or trial, various forms of physical and psychological abuse, and the extrajudicial murder of American citizens on the order of the President. All of these are facilitated by electronic eavesdropping, as is state terrorism by drones and death squads. Like the inhabitants of countries we condemn for gross violations of human rights, Americans are now subject to warrantless surveillance of our electronic interactions with each other, the arbitrary seizure at the border of our computers and private correspondence, the use of torture and degrading practices in interrogation and pretrial detention, and prosecution upon evidence we cannot see or challenge because it is classified. In the 13 years since the 21st century began, many of the rights that once defined our republic have been progressively revoked, in particular those enumerated in the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments to our Constitution. The freedoms that have been curtailed include the rights to immunity from searches and seizures, except, and I quote, upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized, unquote. The right not to be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The right to a speedy and public trial and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation. Mr. Snowden has brought home to us that while we Americans do not yet live in a police state or tyranny, we are well along in building the infrastructure on which either could be instantly erected if our leaders decided to do so. No longer protected by the law, our freedoms now depend on the self-restraint and goodwill of men and women in authority, many of them in uniform. History protests that if one builds a turnkey totalitarian state, those who hold the keys will sooner or later turn them. One does not have to approve of Mr. Snowden's conduct to recognize the service he's done us by exposing the cancerous growth of our government surveillance apparatus. The issues before us, I think, are neither his character nor the punishment he should receive. The issues we must address are, first, how much domestic surveillance can be reconciled with the Constitution and the immunities from government intrusion it once guaranteed to individuals and groups. And second, and here I agree, of course, with Susan in bringing in the private sector's intrusions into those immunities as well. And second, where and against which foreigners and to what extent such electronic snooping should be carried out abroad. The United States was founded on the principle that government is best that governs least. The concept of limited government is wholly incompatible with the notion of an omniscient executive, still less one that is protected by secrecy from both accountability and the checks and balances imposed by independent judicial review, congressional and public oversight, or even common sense. Yet we can no longer be in any doubt that our fear of foreign and domestic terrorism has caused us to nurture just such a governmental leviathan. Judicial checks on surveillance activities by an essentially co-opted FISA court have been both minimal and ineffectual. NSA has in fact not always heeded these rulings in any case. There is no evidence of congressional pushback against the steady expansion of snooping on Americans or foreigners, or of presidential efforts to restrain either. The very members of Congress responsible for intelligence community oversight professed to be shocked when they learned about the scope of NSA's eavesdropping on both Americans and foreign leaders. The president claimed ignorance. Whether these political postures reflect dishonesty or incompetence is unclear. What is not in doubt is that there has been a massive ongoing failure by our government to conduct its intelligence activities in a manner supportive of our liberties and our alliances with foreign nations. Both oversight and management of intelligence collection programs need urgent corrective surgery. And it is time for a major pruning of the jungle of surveillance programs that national hysteria about terrorism, essentially limitless funding, and the burgeoning technical capabilities of our modern age have combined to produce. The very purpose of the state is the management of the nation's defense. To do this, the authorities must have situational awareness and early warning of possible threats from both state and non-state actors. SIGINT, like other forms of espionage and diplomatic reporting and analysis, is certainly part of the answer to this need. But SIGINT was invented to support actions on the battlefield. For the most part, it remains a military project. We should not ask our military to exercise restraint when attacking perceived threats. Armies are not expected to play by the rules, but to win. They are inevitably inclined to overkill. It's been said that an elephant is a mouse built to military specifications. True to the military culture of excess from which it sprang, NSA is an intrusive collection apparatus that has evolved to, quote, collect it all, unquote. All is much too much. Given their invisibility, secret programs have a particular propensity to expand beyond their original purposes. The view that activities that are not legal are not necessarily illegal, and that any and all technology should be exploited à l'outrance is what underlies the decision to collect it all. It's hardly surprising that this has become NSA's self-proclaimed mission. Why does a chicken cross the road? Why does a dog lick its balls? Because it can. Why does NSA snoop on everyone, everywhere online? Because it has the money and the means to do so, not because what it collects meets any valid, externally determined national requirement, standard of efficiency, or foreign policy judgment. The fact that we're able to do things that violate the trust and privacy of others does not make it wise or appropriate to do them. What we've seen since 9/11 is a combination of adaptation to new international circumstances and a growing ration of purposeless program growth, only tangentially related to threats to our national security. In the case of SIGINT, this is a dangerous misdirection of resources. Conventional threats of all kinds are now minimal, but cyber threats are escalating. SIGINT capabilities should be focused on potential enemies and on defending citizens and their government against foreign cyber intrusions, theft, and sabotage. not on collecting information about citizens in the United States or other democracies. It is neither necessary nor proper to spy on democratic foreign allies who do not spy on us. It is not necessary because these allies are open societies that debate their basic policies in public, and we are represented in their capitals by diplomatic missions whose purpose, in part, is to keep our government informed about their motivations, reasoning, plans, and operations. If we need to understand these societies and their capabilities better, we should strengthen our diplomacy, not our covert military trespasses against them. Mr. Snowden documented misbehavior that was a Pandora's box of embarrassments waiting to burst open. It should have been seen as such by those who authorized and carried it out. Their overreach has now done great damage to our moral standing internationally. This is a painful reminder that eavesdropping on allies is no more compatible with a mutually respectful and cooperative relationship than behaving like a peeping Tom is with friendship. By alienating our foreign admirers and supporters, we've weakened our country's political influence abroad. By hacking into our great information technology companies to create Trojan horses, our government has spread distrust of U.S. products and services and damaged the competitiveness of our economy. By belying the decent respect for the opinions of mankind with which we inaugurated our nation, Washington has catalyzed a global loss of confidence in the righteousness of American leadership. By showing suspicious contempt for allies and ready hostility toward other nations, Americans have undermined the prospects for future international cooperation with allies and on our armed forces, as well as peaceful coexistence with our competitors. In the Cold War, we Americans and our allies justly saw ourselves as threatened with nuclear annihilation or ideological subjugation. Someone in Moscow could turn a key, and most of us would soon be dead. The threats before us are in no way comparable, yet in the face of a diminished danger, our leaders have chosen, mostly in secret, to defend our freedoms and preserve our international standing in ways that diminish both. Our own government has become a vastly more potent threat to the traditions and civil liberties of our republic and to the rule of law than Al-Qaeda ever could hope to be. Our ability to intercept, decipher, and understand the communications of those who wish us ill is an invaluable competency. But it is a capability, as Joel said, that coexists uneasily with a free society, as well as with cooperation with other free societies. Those who exercise it are, for the most part, patriots attempting to defend our nation, not infringe on its liberties. But our misapplication of their ability to eavesdrop on their fellow citizens, as well as democratic allies who do not spy on us, is a perversion of its purpose that must be curtailed. The collection of intelligence is essential to our national security. It is not and cannot be an end in itself. And in a democracy, it cannot be safely conducted without judgment based on a sense of propriety and self-restraint born of deference to the rule of law. Freedom requires checks and balances, not paternalistic monitoring by the government. It is now incontrovertible that we have failed to apply effective checks and balances to core national security and intelligence functions. No one in Washington or anywhere else should be in a position to turn a key and deprive us or our posterity of the blessings of liberty. It's past time to rethink and radically downsize both the warfare state and the undisciplined surveillance apparatus it has given birth to. Thank you.